Excellent. Thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. It's great to see you all virtually, And if we can just take a moment, I know we have a couple folks that are still trickling in here, but just wanting to formally welcome you all to one of three climate conversations that we'll be having over the next few weeks here. And if you can take a moment to hover over your name, if you'd like to change your name with your first name and your neighborhood, that would be really, really fantastic. So in order to do that, click on participants, hover over your name, click the more option, and then rename. So we'll give everybody just a moment to do that, and just sharing which neighborhood you are coming from, virtually coming from in the city of Shoreline or beyond. And then once you've had a moment to do that, we would love to see and hear from you all via the Zoom chat. So if you can open up the chat, and we will be putting prompts into the chat throughout the course of today's session here. But we would love for you to answer this one question, and the prompt will be in the chat in just a moment. So imagine it is 2050. What does transportation look like in an ideal shoreline? Imagine it is 2050. What does transportation look like in an ideal shoreline? And feel free to put your response in the chat. From Elise, from the Meridian neighborhood, sidewalks, bike lanes. From Courtney, from Richmond Hills, Highlands, hopefully less cars. From Kara, from North City, electric cars along treed streets. From Maggie, from Highland Terrace, she would say lots of public transit, electric buses, more bike lanes. From Bob, seamless public transportation. From Stephanie, from Parkwood, zero emissions, fully accessible. From Max, from Richmond Highlands, lots of bikes and bike lanes. From Tina, from Richmond Beach, everyone has electric vehicles and there are community charging stations. From Susan, from Echo Lake, link rail connection throughout the region, bike lanes, more walking trails. From Lee, from Briarcrest, every vehicle is electric, multiple bike lanes, tree plantings in all areas. From Kimmy, from Highland Terrace, multiple light rail routes, free public transit with lots of walking and bike paths, charging stations from electric vehicles. Kirk, from Echo Lake, shorter distances between stores and home, so we can bike and walk rather than drive. From Amaya, from Richmond Highlands, sidewalks and be able to walk, take bikes safely, and take public transportation everywhere. Thank you all so much for sharing. And if you didn't get a chance yet to respond to this question, feel free to keep putting your responses and your vision for what 2050 should look like in the city of Shoreline as it relates to transportation in the chat. And with that, we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Great. So I'm going to be going over both the meeting purpose and then how we're going to get there, the agenda for tonight's conversation. So in terms of our purpose, we have several purposes that we would like to accomplish with you all and plan to accomplish with you all over the next 2 hours. And we are meeting from 6 to 8 today. And as Cameron mentioned, the first portion, you'll be hearing a couple of presentations, both from Cameron Reed as well as Nora Daly Pang from the city of Shoreline, before we then head into breakout rooms to review and discuss proposed transportation strategies and actions. So presentation on the front end to get everybody in the same starting place in terms of what's happening around the landscape in regards to transportation, and then heading into the breakout rooms for a deeper dive. So in terms of the purpose, reviewing climate action planning process. So this is a several step process. And so Cameron will be sharing the CAP overview with you all and where we've been and where we're headed. And there are 3 parts to this process, to the CAP process as well. And so we'll be providing, we had one community conversation late fall of last year, and many of you were in attendance there. And so we'll be providing a brief recap of the feedback that we heard from phase 1 and that first community conversation back in the fall. We'll also be sharing our goals for phase 2. So what's coming both in tonight's conversation as well as the 2 subsequent community conversations that follow this one. introducing proposed transportation strategies and actions, and then reviewing those actions in that deeper dive with you all via the breakout rooms. And then we'll be wrapping up and adjourning very close to 8 o'clock, getting you out on time. And just want to pause here for just a brief moment before I turn it back over to Cameron for that first agenda item, the climate action plan overview. Any questions on tonight's agenda and how we're going to get there? Okay, not seeing any questions in the chat, no hand raises. And so with that, we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And I will turn it over to you, Cameron.
Thanks so much, Gretchen. Yeah, so as many of you are, I'm sure, aware, we are updating Shoreline's Climate Action Plan, or CAP. So just wanted to talk about kind of an overview of the project and where we are in the process. Next slide, please. So just for a bit of context, Shoreline completed our first climate action plan as a city back in 2013 to assess greenhouse gas emissions from both the Shoreline community and from Shoreline operations, and to identify strategies to reduce those emissions. Since 2013, we've implemented many of those recommendations and have seen community-wide emissions drop about 1.5% since 2009, despite a growing population. However, we need to reduce emissions much more drastically if we are going to do our part to help limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the level recommended by the best available science. And I'll say a little bit more about those specific targets for Shoreline a little bit later. But the CAP is really going to focus on these three areas, right? Reducing emissions, and key transformative actions that the city can take to reduce community-wide emissions with a near-term focus. But we also know that climate change is already here. It's already impacting Shoreline and communities around the world. For us, we're seeing things like more extreme heat days in the summer, more frequent wildfire smoke, less snowpack in the mountains, and heavier rainfall in the winter. So we no longer have the option of just working on reducing emissions. We have to make sure our community is prepared and equipped and safe and protected from these impacts. And we also know that climate change impacts people differently and will impact people differently, especially those who are already facing issues such as housing affordability and systemic racism. So the climate action plan, we really need to address and center equity and make sure that the actions we take to address climate change benefit everyone and include those who are most vulnerable to these impacts. We really will have a near-term focus in this CAP. So, 2030, next 9 to 10 years, what are the most transformative actions we can take as a city that will set us on a path to reach net zero emissions or 95% emissions reduction by 2050. Next slide, please. And so where are we at in this process? So we started last year and finished up an inventory of our 2019, of our emissions for Shoreline using 2019 data. We formed a group of community climate advisors, which includes some of you. We've opened a survey and held an initial community climate conversation, as Gretchen mentioned, back in November, to really help set a vision and priorities for the plan. And I'm actually going to pass it back to Gretchen to recap some of what we heard in that first community climate conversation. Gretchen?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So we had both an interactive discussion, very similar to what we'll be having tonight, around a different topic. We also had a couple of different polls as well. And so one of the polls where we asked people what was really important to them. So we posed the question, what is important, what is very important that the city of Shoreline take action, whether it's very important, not at all important. And so we just scale that people could pick from. And 93% of the participants that took the poll and that were present that night said that it was very important that the city of Shoreline take action on climate change. And also indicated as part of this poll that the most important factors to consider when evaluating actions were both climate resiliency as well as ecosystem health. And we also posed the question and had a conversation via breakout groups about a community vision for Shoreline. So similar to, we asked you a very specific question as it relates to transportation, we asked a broader question about community vision for Shoreline in 2050. And some of the themes that came out of that discussion and that conversation were improved public transportation, biking, walking infrastructure, renewable energy, healthy and vibrant habitats and ecosystems, a welcoming and inclusive community, as well as strong climate leadership. And then we also got some feedback from phase 1 of engagement that will inform the development of criteria to select actions. So we talked through the various different options and pathways for the type of criteria that would be used to select options, to select actions as well. You can go to the next slide, please. And then I won't be reading through each of these, but we did just want to share and give a recap of what we heard from our participants in terms of what the community loves about Shoreline, what the community wants to see more of, because we asked, what do you want to see more of? What do you want to see less of? So these 4 bullets capture what the community wants to see more of, and then some of the top concerns that people voiced as well. And we'll just leave that up for just a moment so you can read through that before I turn it back over to Cameron in just a couple of slides here. Great, so we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Excellent, and so we wanted to bookend this piece before we did a deeper dive into the transportation conversation with where we are right now. And as Cameron mentioned, we're in phase 2. Where we're talking with you all about strategies and actions, getting your initial feedback on the actions as they relate to transportation. We will have 2 other climate conversations in the upcoming weeks as well. And so you'll see that phase 2, that box is where we are right now. And we will also, as part of that, we'll be hearing kind of an overview of emission sources in each of the climate conversations, and then reviewing the draft strategies and actions for each of those focus areas, to hear from you all about your level of support for the actions, about implementation opportunities and challenges, as well as equity concerns. And so before we dive more deeply into this, would love to hear from you all. If you have any questions based on the overall process, where we've been and where we're headed.
And for questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or there's should be a raise hand feature in the reactions button. And so just raise your hand and we can get you unmuted to ask a question.
Thanks, Cameron. We've got a hand up from Kara from North City.
Hi, I was just wondering, Cameron, you said something earlier in the first slide, I think, what is Shoreline? And I was wondering what Shoreline has done to reduce climate impact so far. Is that a fair question to ask right now?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, great question. I would say we are ahead of the curve of a lot of different municipalities working on this. We completed a climate impacts and resiliency study looking at, kind of started from our stormwater infrastructure, so kind of from like the flooding and drainage side, but it looked at a whole range of different impacts to our community, and we're starting to build some tools around this resiliency piece into kind of how we plan projects, physical projects and policies. But it's starting to be like a much more growing field, I would say, that more and more cities are looking at. And yeah, and we will totally do a deep dive into resilience at our March 30th workshop. So I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Kara. Any other questions about the process, where we've been and where we're headed? Looking in the chat, also seeing if there are any hand raises. There are a few moments before we'll head into our deep dive and the first main agenda item for the night. Got a hand up from Courtney from Richmond Highlands.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So maybe you guys already covered this, but Cameron, when you said that Shoreline is kind of further along in this whole thing than other municipalities, I'm curious how we got here. Is this through like some grants that we got, or just through city initiatives, or residents are like, hey, I really want to talk about climate? Do you have any idea why we would be further along than others? And maybe a second part to that question is, are there other municipalities that are way beyond us that we could learn from?
Yeah, no, good question. I think I was speaking specifically to the resilience piece, kind of starting to look at how can we make sure all of our infrastructure and looking at being forward thinking about the impacts and the impacts that we're seeing for resilience. But yeah, so in terms of climate, yeah, I think the Shoreline community has really driven this. This has come at the council level. It's something that our community has wanted to be involved in. But we are definitely, I would say, in just the general climate space, we are, we're part of a group of King County cities that is working together on some of these joint kind of, because a lot of these are regional issues too. So I would say we're like part of the pack, that's working on that, maybe at the front of the pack. So it's not like we're way out in front. And there are certainly, yeah, I think a lot of bigger cities in the US and elsewhere, in Europe and Canada are definitely way beyond us and are doing some really excellent work that we can pull from. We've been able to, pull a lot of things from City of Seattle and kind of right size them for Shoreline. So that's been a nice kind of local partnership.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Cameron. And final question here from Diane and Sid from Echo Lake.
Hi. Am I working?
Yes.
Hi, Cameron. This is Sid. Hey, I spent some time looking through the 2013 plan, and the salient thought that I had from that was how it's formatted and who the reader is expected to be, because it's like 86 or so pages long, and I'm there thinking, don't expect me to plow through 86 pages in order to be able to digest this. What is it possible to have a document where if I have a question, I can access the document and find what I'm looking for, as opposed to feeling like I have to sit down with 2 hours of time to go through it? Because most people, I don't think, are going to approach it that way.
Totally, that's a great point, Sid. And I think our goal for this climate action plan, especially because we're not starting from zero. We've done a lot of things. We're building off of things. So I think our goal is that it will be much clearer and more digestible and really focused on some of these high impact strategies. So ideally, you could fit the gist of it on a page, maybe front and back of like, here's what we're actually doing and focusing on. So that's the goal. And yeah, definitely want to at least have some summary documents that are very accessible in sort of common lay language that we can make available to the community.
Right, because I think it comes down to whether the document is something that the city puts out as a way to show what it's doing, kind of like, this is what I'm doing, give me a pat on the back. Vice, a document you put out to the community as a tool for them to see how they play into this strategy, which is a completely different thing to me. Right now it seems like a resume. The city's done this, the city's done that, great. But what does that mean to me as a citizen, other than to think, okay, the city's on top of this? And maybe that's the goal of this kind of document, but I was thinking maybe it could be more. It could be an educational thing for people. And again, for people who don't have 2 or 3 hours to sit down with it to navigate through 86 pages.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
Great input. And yeah, we will absolutely keep it in mind as we move into, once we get to the stage of creating the next plan. And I'm going to keep us moving here. I do see a comment from Marla about community solar. So we are going to get into, we're focusing on transportation tonight, getting into strategies and actions related to that, but I see that there. And then we have a question from Judith that we didn't get to, but at the end, if we're able to get to it, we've captured it around percentage of Shoreline residents and what the percentage of Shoreline residents seem to think that climate change is not a threat. So we'll circle back on that if we've got time. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cameron for an overview and goals, targets, and the action list related to transportation.
Great. Thanks, Gretchen. So yeah, diving into transportation here, and we can go to the next slide. So from a climate perspective, I mean, transportation is one of the most significant areas that both individuals and the city have at least some control over. And so based on our 2019 inventory, transportation was the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Shoreline. So you can see it there. It's that sort of bold teal color. It accounted for 56% of our direct emissions in 2019. You can click one more time, Alicia. I think there's a couple animations here. So transportation was 56%. The second largest category, which is that kind of the greenish color, was the natural gas use in homes and buildings. And we'll talk about that more at the event on the 16th. And so just a reminder, this inventory is for all of Shoreline, right? Not just city operations. And it includes direct emissions. So things like from our actual utility consumption for heating and cooling, from our miles driven in fuel consumption, and from the waste that we generate. But it doesn't include the consumption or the production of goods and services that we consume. So that's an important thing that we weren't able to capture. And so diving into that teal section, this largely comes from passenger vehicles and trucks, light trucks. About 80% of the transportation emissions were from gasoline use. The other 20% were from diesel vehicles, so largely the heavier trucks and buses. And for context, we've seen some progress, about a 1% decrease in transportation emissions since 2009 when we started measuring, and the miles driven per person in Shoreline has gone down. But the huge caveat here is that our population is projected to continue to grow. Next slide, please. And so this is a graph that I'm super excited to share with you tonight. So this is a wedge model where we are looking at that population growth. So on the left side, we're starting at 2019, and this is going into the future with benchmarks at 2030 and 2050. And so that top dotted line represents basically a do nothing scenario, and it shows where emissions would be with the projected growth in population. And so you can see how high emissions would be by 2050 with the amount of growth we're projecting to see. However, we've already taken significant steps at both the state, national, and local levels to reduce emissions, and those are represented by the bold or solid colored bands. So you can see in the orange spectrum, we have building-related actions. The impact on the top is the Washington State Clean Energy Transformation Act, passed in 2019. The second one in the middle is the Washington State Energy Code updates that went into effect last year. And then that solid orange, or the darkest orange, is the ban on fossil fuel heating in new commercial and multifamily construction that we passed here in Shoreline at the end of last year. And then in the green are actions we've already taken related to transportation, and those include higher fuel efficiency standards passed at the federal level. So that's the light green. It's a pretty big chunk. The middle green represents emissions reductions from the clean fuel standard passed in Washington State last year. And then lastly, the dark green band represents the efforts we've taken to support higher density development centered around transit, especially near the future light rail stations. So this type of housing with easy access to transit has a much, much lower climate impact than single family housing, especially new single family housing built elsewhere in King County, especially like farther east in the county, further from employment centers. And so that together, the sum of those, we can see that gets us to about a 10% emissions reduction by 2030 and about a 20% by 2050, which is pretty good considering the population growth and how high that would be. However, the dark blue dots and that line on the bottom represents where we need to be to hit our science-based targets. So those are calling for a 60% emissions reduction by 2030 and 95% by 2050. So this blue delta is what we still need to address through the state and through through the climate action plan, and with further action at the state, individual, national, at all levels of society, really. And so this really just illustrates the need for additional transformative action to get there. And clicking one more time. And so here's how that dark blue breaks out in terms of the emission sources. So again, natural gas use is on that top orange band. And we're starting here at 2019 on the left side. And the green bands, the 3 green bands, are transportation. And down at the bottom, you can see our solid waste and electricity. And because we have access to clean hydropower through Seattle City Light, our electricity grid has very, very low impact. So that's that brown, and that's tapering off with the impacts of CETA. And so with that context in mind, I would love to invite Nora, our transportation planner, to give some quick snapshots of different transportation strategies we are using and are considering to use more extensively as a city, both in the climate action plan and the transportation master plan update. So I'll hand it over to you, Nora. And I think you're muted.
Oh, there we go. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. My name is Nora Daly Pang, and I'm the Senior Transportation Planner with the city. And we've been talking a lot about transformative actions so far, and I wanted to just start with, as a city, I think we are in the midst of transforming from an auto-oriented suburb to a people-centered community with more mobility options. And I always like to just start out with kind of our place in the world to center. Sorry, just a minute. Lost my cliff notes. Okay, we're back on. All right, so first let's look at where Shoreline is in the world. So we have about a population of 55,000. And of course, we all know that we are a part of this lovely place called the Puget Sound region, which happens to be one of the fastest growing areas in the USA. And in the next 30 years, our region is expected to grow by 40%. So the question really is how can we continue to grow and at the same time keep our city not just livable, but lovable? And I think one of the answers lies in how we can synergize growth with transportation choices. So next slide. So although Shoreline is just a small city, under 12 square miles, in the US, about 50% of all trips are local, within 3 miles from home. But most of them are by car. And only a mere 2% of those local trips are by bike. So I think there's an animation here. And of course, we have hills, and they pose a major barrier to walking and biking. But with the emergence of e-bikes and e-scooters, I believe that they can really help to flatten those hills and encourage folks to use something other than driving their own personal vehicle for small local trips. Next slide. And talking more about transformation, with 2 light rail stations opening in 2024 and the anticipated growth and density around those stations, Shoreline must shape the future of multimodal transportation within our community, but also within the Puget Sound region. Next slide. So currently, we all, I think, know and feel this, that Shoreline's land use is predominantly single-family homes. The city rezoned areas around the light rail stations for density. Next slide, sorry, or animation. For density and also a variety of housing choices. And we're already starting to see that transformation in Shoreline. Next slide. So within just the next 15 years, Shoreline expects to have more than a third of its residents living with just within a 10-minute walk from a light rail station, and almost everyone living within a 10-minute bike ride of a light rail station. Great, so next slide. So with the development of light rail along in Shoreline and through Shoreline, this really presents a unique opportunity to build a 2.5-mile trail adjacent to that light rail alignment. And that's shown in this graphic as that center dashed green line. We call it the trail along the rail, and it will provide direct pedestrian and bike access to light rail stations, parks, schools, business districts, and more. And by the time the light rail opens, approximately 20 blocks, non-contiguous blocks, but 20 blocks of the trail will be ready for use. The trail also fits into a larger regional vision of connecting and growing a trail network, including the interurban trail, which you see as that green line on the left. And I imagine a lot of you know and love and use that. And then also the Burke-Gilman Trail that wraps around Lake Washington, shown on the right there as a green line. Of course, the east-west connections are really important to tie this whole regional system together. And those are shown locally here as those orange lines, east-west lines. Okay, next slide. So one of those east-west connectors that I mentioned is the proposed 148th Street non-motorized bridge in the heart of the 148th Street Station subarea. And this bridge will provide a crossing over I-5 that has really divided the city for decades. And with the addition of this bridge, pedestrians and cyclists will directly connect to the future light rail station, as well as the trail along the rail. Next slide. The key to promoting mode shift. So what I mean by mode shift is providing transportation choices that are so safe, economical, and fun that people will naturally choose them over driving alone. In 2016, the city adopted a complete streets ordinance that requires all roadway projects to be designed to accommodate all travel modes, including walking, biking, driving, and riding transit. This policy provides the legal teeth to shift away from an auto-dependent community, one project at a time. Next slide. Just touching on some other ways to make transportation choices attractive. Of course, there's bike parking. I think it's much overlooked as a way to provide or really encourage cyclists for both cycling for both commuting and recreation. When you know that there's a safe and secure place for you to park your bike, you're much more likely to take that trip. Next slide. I want to touch on an important emerging concept called shared use mobility. Its focus is on providing multiple forms of transportation that people can share either at the same time, like taking a bus or carpool or taking the light rail, or one after the other, like using bike share or scooter share. Next slide. Mobility hubs are places of connectivity where different modes of transportation come together seamlessly at concentrations of employment, housing, shopping, and recreation. It can provide space for bike share, scooter share, car to go or car share, as well as curb space for things like ride hailing pickups like Uber and Lyft. To maximize the use of the upcoming light rail and to support car light or car free lifestyles, the city is interested in creating mobility hubs in strategic locations across Shoreline. And last year, the city engaged with the University of Washington Evans School Consulting Lab to research how shared use mobility hubs could support travel throughout the city. And now the city is working on integrating their findings into the transportation master plan. Next slide. Okay, wrapping up here with neighborhood pathways. Often informal dirt paths throughout the city are another amenity that allow people to get away from busy streets and enjoy a moment in nature. These pathways can provide a more direct route to accessing key destinations and encourage walking. Next slide. So I'm going to just wrap up for now by putting in a plug for the Transportation Master Plan update. We call it the TMP. I am the project manager for it, and we are really in the midst of that project, and we hope that you will get involved with that too. There's the website, and in my last slide has my contact information. Next slide, please. Great, and there's my contact information if you have any questions or want to find out more about the TMP. I would now like to turn it back over to Cameron to talk about goals, strategies, and actions. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nora. You can go to the next slide, please. So bringing it back to the climate action plan, we really have two main goals related to transportation. It's very straightforward. And as Nora mentioned, a lot in this first bucket of reducing community-wide driving, that feeds into the work Nora's doing with the Transportation Master Plan update. So I really do encourage you, that's where a lot of the actual infrastructure planning gets hashed out for the different transportation modes. So the CAP will, sort of frame it in terms of emissions and where we need to go. But I do encourage you to stay involved with the Transportation Master Plan as well. So under reduced driving, obviously this is a major challenge, as Nora mentioned, transitioning from a car-dependent suburb, and will require significant continued work and investment to move to a community where you don't need a car for basic living. So, the strategies, super high level strategies, and we'll dive into the actions in our breakout group that fit under these, but, increasing neighborhood walkability. So that's through our land use policies, through policies related to parking, and through other things we can do to try to encourage business amenities, closer and walkable distance to neighborhoods, and safe infrastructure to get people there. And again, a lot of that infrastructure work happens through the TMP. And then supporting biking and shared use mobility options. So giving people options, as Nora mentioned, this is again, infrastructure, also, the bike parking throughout the community, and then shared use options. So we brought up the e-bikes and e-scooters, looking at, are there ways we can pilot or support those programs, support that use by residents and businesses, do things like e-bike libraries with community partners, that sort of thing. And then lastly would be to enhance public transit and commute trip reduction programs. So, we work through transit providers like King County Metro and Sound Transit. So continue to coordinate better access to transit, especially east to west, connecting to the future light rail stations. And then, finding programs and things that we can do to help encourage less commuting by at businesses and other of the major employers in the city. And then the second thing that the CAP will really take the lead on for us as a city is EV adoption. So, we're already seeing pretty huge market growth and investment, really from all the major automakers, and a lot of work at the Washington state level to support this. And here in Shoreline, this becomes a really key strategy because, as I mentioned, our electricity grid is essentially carbon free. So it's very, very low emissions from Seattle City Light. And so switching from a conventional fuel vehicle to an electric option is, significantly lowers our direct emissions, and it's a key climate action strategy. So we need to do everything we can to support this transition by, educating the community about available incentives and possibly developing new ones. We also need to really ramp up our charging infrastructure, make sure that it's convenient and accessible, that new buildings have capacity for more charging, and assist building owners in installing charging stations at existing buildings. And then lastly, we hope to lead the way in terms of electrifying our own fleet vehicles as rapidly as we can. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Gretchen to orient us to the breakout groups, or I think, yeah, a Q&A.
Yeah, we're going to pause just for a moment before we head into our small group discussions. And just pause. You heard a lot of great information, both from Nora and from Cameron. And we've got a few questions in the chat. So I'm going to start from the top, but feel free if anything, a question did arise and you want to raise your hand or put a question in the chat, feel free to do that, and we'll get to as many as we can over the next 5 minutes or so. We've got a question from Shannon. How might current legislation, both that is being proposed and bills that have passed, affect transportation? Nora or Cameron, want to take that one?
Yeah, I don't have a concrete analysis of ones that are currently in the works. I know there were quite a few climate related bills in this session that we're tracking and advocating for as they align with our joint commitments through the K4C. But that graph I shared, the wedge graph, does show the impact of some of the bills that have already been passed, both national and at Washington State.
Thanks, Cameron. Nora, anything more to add to that?
No.
Okay, great. And so there's a question from Lisa in the chat regarding bike parking. Is there a secure lock system to keep patrons' bikes safe while bikes are parked? And is there a fee for that?
At light rail stations, or did it specify where?
It didn't. Lisa, are you able to clarify your question?
Yeah, just trying to look at her proposal she was saying, and what do you envision this being? Is that people could pull up to a Fred Meyer, ride their bike there, park it, go in and shop for 30 minutes? Or are we talking just at the transportation hubs?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. I think citywide, people's destinations are everywhere, and we really need to do, I think, an inventory of where the need is out there. You know, what are those major magnets that would, if we had bike parking, if whether it's going to businesses or parks or the library, and is today's parking adequate? And you know, a lot has changed in the industry of bike parking, and really that question about if it's adequate is probably no, because a lot of the older school bike racks, they really don't properly secure bikes. So I think we would like to, as a city, dig into that and develop a bike parking plan and think about how we can implement that.
Thanks, Nora. And we also have a response from Jeff in the chat as well with some more information about bike parking. Great. Scrolling through the chat here. Great, some information about current legislation in the chat. And then from Bob, are there current new development requirements for EV charging stations?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So we do have what's called an EV readiness ordinance. So that requires charging capacity for a certain percentage of the parking spaces at new commercial and multifamily construction. And they're different percentages. I think it's more for a multifamily, like an apartment building, than for a business. But there's not anything currently for single family residential, because that is part of the state, or the residential energy code is set at the state level. So we can't modify it at the local Shoreline level.
Thanks, Cameron. Specific question in the chat from Kara, with light rail station at 185th and not really close to a lot of amenities, what are the plans for public transportation from 185th station to Aurora? Nora, can you answer that?
Yes, the city actually did a corridor study a couple of years ago. That's called the 185th Multimodal Corridor Study. And it's on our city's webpage, and it really envisions a roadway system that will provide transportation choices to and from the light rail station and the neighborhoods like Aurora, the commercial businesses on Aurora, and also up to North City. So check that out on our city's webpage, 185th Multimodal Corridor Strategy.
Thanks, Nora. And final question, we've got a hand up from Tracy from Lake Forest Park.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm just wondering if there are any plans in the works for introducing microtransit like Linwood's been doing between the convention center and their light rail station?
Yes. Did you want to answer that, Cameron?
No, you go for it, Nora.
I think that's definitely one of the things that we need to look at. And we are, like I was saying, we are in the midst of developing a transportation master plan update. And we do have this concept of shared use mobility that can include micro transit, small shuttles, if I'm following what you're asking, like circulator shuttles to get you to different destinations. Yeah, I think it's a consideration. We don't have any plans right now, but I definitely encourage you to get involved with the TMP update.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. And then a follow-up question from Jeff in the chat about is there a plan to provide more amenities close to the stations?
That's a great question. Nora, do you know much about what's planned specifically at the stations?
We do have a website that's called Destination 2024, and it focuses specifically on our 148th Street station and all of the projects, the implementation projects in and around that station to give folks a sense of what's changing. One of them I highlighted in my presentation was the 148th Street proposed head bike bridge.
Thank you.
Definitely a key strategy, right? Is connecting people to that last mile connection to get people to and from the light rail.
Excellent. Thank you for your questions. We are going to go ahead and move into the interactive session of the night, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. In just a moment, on your screen, you will appear an option to head into a breakout room, and each of the breakout rooms, they're randomly assigned. So you'll head into one of 5 breakout rooms, and each of the breakout rooms have an assigned facilitator. And what we'll be doing is we will be diving into some of the strategies and the associated actions with those strategies. And we'll be specifically asking you a set of questions. And we'll be asking you, how supportive are you of these actions? And before we ask that question, we will be orienting you to what suite of actions are part of the various strategies that we'll be diving into in each of the breakout rooms. And so based on what you're seeing, and each of the facilitators will be sharing their screen, we'll be using a platform called Mural, where we'll be capturing all of your input in real time on virtual sticky notes and asking you, how supportive are you of these actions? Do you have any changes you'd like to make to a particular action, to the suite of actions? Are there any concerns you have with any particular action that you're seeing or the suite of actions? We'll also be asking you to take a look through an equity lens. So looking at each action or again, the suite of actions, are there groups of people that would be more burdened or benefit more by a particular action? We're wanting to flag that as well. And then overall, are there any crucial strategies and or actions that are missing? Do you have any new ideas for strategies and actions that are not on the list that you'll be looking at? And so we will have roughly 15 minutes to be in the breakout rooms and have these deeper dives with a facilitator that will be sharing their screen and sharing these actions with you all in a bit more detail. And before we head into our breakout rooms, I just want to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions related to either the breakout room structure or what we're proposing to accomplish in these breakout rooms. Okay, so with that, Haley, just let us know when the breakout rooms are ready to go. And also want to note, one thing I forgot to mention is that we will be coming back, because I know it'll be really interesting, likely interesting to you all to hear, well, what did the other groups talk about? And so we'll be doing, each of the facilitators will be prepared to provide a short recap of what some of the highlights that came out of the conversation, and when we reconvene as a full group. So Haley, let us know when we're ready to roll here.
Yeah, are you ready to send people?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'm going to open the rooms.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Haley. And quick reminder to facilitators to please hit record in the rooms when you get there. Excellent. Welcome back, everybody, to the main room. We're going to do, recognizing that everybody had really interactive conversations, lots of great conversation across rooms, wanting to share a little bit, some insights and key highlights from each of the conversations across the 5 breakout rooms. So we're just going to go facilitator by facilitator, breakout room by breakout room, and get a recap of some of the themes and comments that were shared. And with that, we are going to go ahead and start with, we're going to start with room 3. And Eric, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Okay. So I think overall, definitely there's support for a lot of these actions that were proposed. I think there's definitely, we had strong conversations around ensuring, trying to figure out how we can get EV charging stations and multifamily housing. Requiring it for new development is one thing, but requiring it or getting into existing multifamily is important. We need to figure out how to do that. We talked about flexible transit, because if more people are using transit, there's a lot of different mobility challenges that people have. It isn't just wheelchairs, it's carts, it's groceries, it's all those things. So making sure that we have transit that is flexible is important to think about. There's strong support about going electric, the city and the school district going electric with their fleets. And then the other is kind of making walking easier across the city, connections to school, connecting across the city. But then also when we talk about walkability, we need to think about, we need to provide seating along the way for people who have mobility challenges or need that seating. We also need to think about, restrooms and facilities for people who are going to be walking and can't get home as quickly as before. So those are also challenges that we need to think about. So those are the ones that we talked about, and it was a great conversation.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing, Eric. And thank you, Breakout Room 3, for all of those insightful comments. Great. So we will head over to Breakout Room 2 and Nora.
Okay. Yeah, it went by really fast. We had a lot of talk about just building education around EV. And we started to get into some of the equity issues around that, in terms of like EVs are really expensive, and how can we make charging more free charging, and also how can we lower the barrier to actually using EVs, or on the flip side of that, how can we get more of those old gas guzzlers off the road? How can we incentivize that part of it? So education is a big part of the change. And we also talked about the differences of fast and slow charging and those options for homeowners versus commercial, and how through education and incentives can make that possible. And then we shifted gears and we talked about the ped bike transit share use mobility. We had a pretty lively conversation about that, and started to talk about more than just the different mobility vehicles, but the actual infrastructure to make people feel comfortable. And my group was remembering some really, great rides, like in Amsterdam, where they have a whole wide dedicated lane for bikes, and that made her feel really comfortable. And then locally, just in Seattle, there's Linden Avenue, part of the interurban trail that's completely dedicated for bikes. So having more of that in Shoreline. And while I'm on the topic, how about borrowing some of those ideas from Seattle about their safe streets, neighborhood greenways, and having that come into Shoreline, and also Lake Forest Park. We had a couple of our neighbors join us tonight, which is great. And the last thing I think is really paying attention to building education awareness and skills for the youth, because that's when you start lifelong practices of walking and biking. And if we can focus on making that accessible, free, and educational and fun, I think our group felt like that would really that would encourage more people to ride and walk. That's about it.
Great. Thanks so much, Nora, for capturing the conversation from Breakout Room 2. And we'll get a quick update from Cameron, Alicia, and myself over the next couple of minutes. Cameron?
Yeah, it was great to hear. We really focused on biking and walking. We talked about the need for really safe bike and well-maintained bike lanes. Talked about like the surfaces being an issue and separated bike paths. Also the need for more education about on both the driver and bicyclist side to really make everybody on the road comfortable. We talked a lot about sidewalks and just a whole host of issues there, including the trees, sidewalks, but really how can we make our streets feel safe? So we talked about speeding and traffic calming, and just generally making places that are separated from cars, making them really enjoyable, walkable places that people want to be.
Great. Thanks, Cameron. And hopping over to you, Alicia, in room 5.
Yeah, thank you. I'd say our breakout room sounds like we had a lot of similar discussions to all of you and to Cameron's breakout room. So we talked about the need for safety to be really before all else, especially related to those goal 1 actions. And we talked a lot about what's realistic and you know how people will use public transit, e-bikes or EVs, and what those shifts need to include. I talked about sidewalks as well. And then we also talked about some conflicts that could come up, for example, with limited number of charging stations. So we had an interesting and productive discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alicia. And our group, really quickly before we head into a quick next steps slide. So lots of support for converting to EVs, but some concerns about access and equity related to that conversion. A real strong desire to speed up the time frame for that conversion. 2050 seemed really far out. Lots of support for public transit if accessible, if safe, efficient, it goes where you need it to go, and it's affordable. Also being more supportive of bike uses, making it safe and secure, both for the rider as well as the bike. And same with pedestrians, needing better safety and security for pedestrians. And then the final thing, reducing the need for mobility. So promoting things like working from home, which is what we've been doing. Great. And in our last 2 minutes here, I'm going to turn it over to Cameron, who's going to share with us the next steps and the exciting things that are just around the corner.
Yeah, thanks so much. So just really quick, and thank you all, and congratulations for sticking around to the end and for your participation. Just want to highlight a couple follow-up opportunities, how we'll use this input. So I will be posting a second survey soon that will include all of these actions in this and all the other focus areas. So I will, stay tuned for that. You can, if this was, I know it was a lot of information, so you'll have more opportunities. We'll also be posting this reporting on the webpage, and I will compile the unanswered questions from the chat here and send those out to all of you. So look out for that in this coming week. And we'll compile the results from all of our breakout conversations into a summary document that we'll publish. And all this feedback will help us really update and narrow down this list of actions, which we're going to come back in the summer with an updated list, and we'll do another workshop to really talk through any final changes. But next up this month, in the meantime, March 16th, we're doing another one of these where we'll dive into buildings, energy, and waste. So talking about electrification of homes and buildings, renewable energy efficiency, and we'll also cover some items related to waste and consumption. So if you're interested, tune in there. Then at the end of the month, we'll come back with sort of a double header where we'll talk about really this idea of resilience and preparedness. So how can we make sure our community is prepared for what's coming and what's here? And then also we'll dive into carbon sequestration. So how can we support our urban forests or other ecosystems in Shoreline to really be carbon rich, to be resilient, and to capture as much carbon as we can. And so the same registration link you should have all seen. Well, it's at shorelinewa.gov/climate. You can also sign up for updates there, and I'll send you an email when we have other opportunities. Last but not least, Nora, do you want to do a quick plug for the TMP?
Oh yeah, thanks. Just if you're interested in hearing more about the TMP update, we are going to have another wave of outreach in April, and you can go to our city's website under TMP update to learn more and follow the project to get email updates. Thank you.
And
Awesome.
I have 8:01, and in the interest of getting you out almost on time, almost exactly at 8 o'clock, thank you all so much. You see Cameron's email here. Please feel free to share any feedback related to this and future conversations with Cameron. And just want to thank you all so much for being here, taking time out of your busy days, being here in the evening, and for your active and thoughtful participation. And we'll see you next time at the upcoming workshop. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.